Welcome to the Divine Council Worldview Podcast number 2. We're going to be studying Genesis 1 in this episode, and I'm Ron Johnson. Again, welcome and glad to bring in to our conversation Mike Chu. How's Boston here in early fall, I guess it is.
It's starting to feel nice and chilly now. It's starting to actually feel like fall for us.
We're below zero pretty much every morning when I look outside, so... Last time we gave some quick introductions and what brings us together. Theologically, it's this thing called the Divine Council Worldview, and it's a unique idea. It deserves its own podcast, so that's why we call it the Divine Council Worldview Podcast. What brings us together practically, again, is the legacy of Dr. Michael Heiser, who's passed away about 9 months ago now. So we're keeping, this is how I feel about it, we're keeping a ball rolling that deserves to gain momentum. So we'll do our best to keep that momentum moving. Last time, during episode number 1, after talking about why we're doing this, we did end with a 6-point overview of the Divine Council Worldview. And if I could just quickly go through those. Again, this is not unique to people who believe in a Divine Council Worldview, but when it comes to defining the worldview, I always think of these 6 things. And that's for the purpose of someone who may have a Divine Council worldview and not know it, or someone who is considering taking it on, what it includes. And I can make it really quick. Number 1, understand the original writer, his intended audience, and the culture they shared going into any study. Number 2, the Bible presumes a society of divine beings who were created by one deity. And of course, a lot to go into that, but that's basically the second point. Number 3, Yahweh, the name of this deity, delegated authoritative power to a number of created deities over the physical world. 4, and again, passing a lot of material, through a lot of material, but getting to number 4 would be Jesus Christ has presently, by the decree of Yahweh, assumed the place of highest honor and power over all gods and humans. Number 5, then, the locus of the gospel message, however you take the meaning of the cross and the various parts of the Christian message, which I grant are many-sided, shall we say, but the locus of the gospel message will be the loyalty that we should show to Jesus Christ and Yahweh, his Father, above all other gods. And then number 6, in the next age, believers will not just go to heaven. We've replaced that in the Divine Council Worldview, and again, this is akin to other discussions too, but in the DCW, we would talk about assuming a status of deity as well, and how that works. Again, much discussion to go, but that's basically the 6-point overview. And I say that because as we come into our study of Genesis 1, there's so many parts, again, so many directions to go in any kind of a Bible study. I'm hoping that people that listen to this podcast are filling up on other podcasts as well, and books and studies. And when it comes to Genesis and even Genesis 1, there's a lot of things to talk about. So we're not trying to cover all topics, but we are trying to be settling in specifically on the concept of a Divine Council worldview in relation to Genesis 1. In fact, we're kind of putting the Divine Council discussion on top of the text, trying to see where it will settle in. So we're purposely not going to settle, or we put it in the positive. We are going to allow other ideas to float through or slip on by as we go down this path. But we're trying to be a clearinghouse again for how a person who is thinking about and looking at the Bible through a Divine Council worldview will interpret the text. So why Genesis? I think we should start, in fact, by that, or with that question. Well, it's the first book of the Bible, so any study on biblical topics, I think it's just a good place generally to jump in. The first word of the book, in the beginning, or in beginning, Bereshit, that's the title of the book, so it's a good jumping off point. Secondly, and I think this is for me, Mike, I don't know how you feel about this, but the idea of a story, trying to understand the biblical text as a ongoing left to right story, to me is very important. And to ask anyone to jump into a Bible study in the book of Joshua, or I think I told the story last time. I hope I did. Tell me if I didn't, Mike, where we had a Bible study in our neighborhood and the people asked, what should we study? And we were thinking they'd say John or something like that. And someone said, well, why don't we start in Genesis? And to me, that makes great sense. So the beginning of a story, it's hard to study any book of the Bible, in my opinion, without going back to Genesis, because you're going to have to appeal to it somewhere, right? And so going to it now, I think, is just a great place specifically for a Divine Council Worldview podcast to start. And then thirdly, providentially, Mike Heiser never got there. Obviously, he was intending, I'm sure, but he said to me in a text once, or was it a phone call, I just feel like I'm running out of time. This was before he got ill, before he knew about his cancer. He had this sense that he was running against the clock. So anything you want to add there, Mike? We're going to jump into Genesis, and I think it makes good sense.
Well, I agree. I think it does make a tremendous amount of sense. And part of that was because, so for my own small group at my church, we've been going through, at least my encouragement as well, is we should try to get through Genesis 1 to 11. And my justification to my small group was pretty much every biblical writer afterwards always refers back to Genesis in some form or fashion. There's always an allusion, an echo, a presumption that's being made, because Genesis is so foundational to the faith. And even more so, I would say, and that was my appeal of let's study Genesis 1 to 11, because it sets up a major issue, a major set of problems that the rest of the greater story, the meta-narrative, however you want to describe it, it's ultimately always going to be referring back to those texts because of how foundational it is. It just presumes when you're reading the rest of the Old Testament and New Testament that you have some working knowledge of what happened in Genesis.
Right. Yeah. They all assumed it to some degree. Have you ever wondered, and this is off topic a bit, but how did Moses know this stuff? How did Moses know that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth? No one's filming this, is the point. If you're going to do a movie on the Bible, you can't have Moses or anyone sitting with a steno pad watching this scene. So everything we're reading here must have been divinely given to, and when we say these words, obviously there's a whole nother subject coming here, but to be divinely given this information would have been A, fascinating, and B, so important to the rest of every other story to follow. So in the beginning, or, once upon a time, and you tell the background to, Sleeping Beauty, whatever, you're setting the stage literally for everything to follow. So nothing new there. I don't think anyone's shocked by these ideas, but it's just, again, a defense for why Genesis needs to be the start of any careful study of the Bible, at least in principle. So let's go right to it. I'm going to bring up my text. Now, this is Accordance, the Bible study program that I'm most familiar with. And Logos and Accordance, and Mike, you're a Logos user, and so am I in the past, but I just got used to Accordance because of, you know what? It was at Dallas Seminary, because that's where I went to school, and everyone there was an Accordance user, so we did all of our work in Accordance. The beauty of a software program is that you can do searches and word studies so quickly. It's almost embarrassing, how much information is at our fingertips. So I'm going to have this up just to be walking through the text. In the beginning, here's how I have set up my screen, by the way. On the left side is the ESV right here. And then in the middle is the New King James. I have that there just for comparison purposes. In fact, right off the bat, it's good to remind ourselves when you look at different, and I always do this, I always have parallel English texts running alongside each other, just to remind myself that the Bible wasn't written in English. So neither of these two left columns are authoritative in that sense. In the back of my mind, I'm always thinking, and there it is on the right, the Hebrew text. This is the BHS critical text that anyone can buy today, and it would be used as the main text in a seminary, for example. So this is a critical text. This is the text that we think today best represents the original Masoretic text, going back to 6th century, something like that. So anyway, that's the background. So as I hover over, notice how this looks. And again, if you don't see the podcast, if you're just listening, I'm going to be describing things hopefully clear enough for you as we go. That when I hover over an English word on the left, it's going to also highlight the Hebrew word on the right. it also at the bottom of the screen gives information about those words. So in the beginning, let's just grab that first one. I wonder, no, it doesn't. Okay, so anyway, beginning. Notice at the bottom, what you have there is beginning. Now that's the gloss. Now and I want to handle these things as an introductory point to be made, because as we study any book of the Bible or Genesis, and we use this kind of a program, this is good, just introductory, oh yeah, kind of information. Beginning is not the translation of the Hebrew word. Beginning is the gloss. And by gloss, we mean a short, pithy, one word. What word do you want to put in place of, in Hebrew, bereshit or reshit? I want to read this. This is from, again, a good book that I would run to in a study of Genesis, The Lost World of Genesis 1 by John Walton. He, see if I can, it's page 9, I think I wrote to myself. This is so helpful, I think, for, again, just any kind of Bible study, especially those who are interested in a Divine Council Worldview. This is on page 9 of The Lost World of Genesis 1 by John Walton. Rather than translating the culture, then, we need to try to enter the culture. When people want to study the Bible seriously, one of the steps they take is to learn the language. As I was teaching language students, I'm always faced with the challenge of persuading them that they will not succeed simply by learning enough of the language to engage in translation. Truly learning the language requires, and here comes the concept that I'm getting at, leaving English behind, entering the world of the text and understanding the language in its Hebrew context without creating English words in their minds. The reason I find that interesting is I remember when C.S. Lewis tells of the story, I think he did it in his autobiography, of learning Greek as an 8-year-old. He wanted to read ploion as a Greek word and not think about a ship or a boat. He wanted to imagine a craft slicing through, the water. In other words, let's get back to it here. When you hear the word beginning in English, and it's even on our screen there as the gloss or the translation of the Hebrew word reshit, Moses never heard of the word beginning. So we are talking in English, we'll deal with English, but to really enter the world of the Bible, we have to enter the idea of what it means to understand reshit, right? And here is where, again, we don't want to get into this because of time, and it's not our area. But what does it mean in the beginning? Various translations go with, obviously, in the beginning. I think it was, you were mentioning to me, Mike, separately, who has the, when God began to create. In other words, without the article, the, which is not in the text, it does open up other possibilities. And so I'm just introducing the idea that right off the bat, when you get into biblical study, we have to deal with the idea we're entering into a different world. And we're doing our best in talking in English, but it's not, again, the final authority. I just hear so many arguments, even on, among good people, good Facebook conversations and such, and we're stuck on English so often. And my first thought in the back of my mind is, guys, we're not talking English here, so we can't even go to those words. But at the bottom of that screen, again, I just want to show what's there. You have the word beginning, the gloss of the Hebrew word reshit. Then you have a H7225. That's just an assigned number. Every Hebrew vocab word, I think it goes up to about 8,600 of them, are assigned a number. And then reshit is the actual Hebrew there. And then the English transliteration, reshit. So as I hover over different words, in fact, I want to get to the word God. That's the next. We're only up to 4 words now in Genesis 1, but we're making headway, I promise you. In the beginning, God. Notice the word God there across the way on the right. The Hebrew word is going to be elohim. At the bottom of the page, again, that word God there, G-O-D. Mm-hmm. I have spent, the equivalent of, I would say, days in Bible college classrooms trying to explain to my students that there is no word God in the Bible. G-O-D does not exist. What does exist is Elohim. So the question of how do we say God, or why would we put the word God there, is a linguistic, historical question. It actually comes from the German word Gott, G-O-T-T, and then you can go backwards from there. And the reason I say all this is because here's what I want to do, is to show you that if I, for example, and there's various things you can do in accordance. I'm sure you can do this in Logos as well. If I triple click on the word, let's see if I can get it here going here. Come on. Yeah, there it comes. It's set to bring up the standard Hebrew dictionary for this, not the Greek or the English word God, but the Hebrew word behind the word God, which in this case is Elohim, there in red. So Halat, this is the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament. It's the standard Hebrew dictionary. So when you take the time to go through all this, and again, it's not common, you would notice that in the singular, he's going to give the definition of a God. When you get into the plural, there's the plural Elohim. Notice what he gives as the first definition, G-O-D-S, but he doesn't have a capital letter on it. Why not? Because look at the third or under C here, God, deity. My point is, and Hebrew catches this right off the bat in our study of Genesis 1, in the beginning, and the word choice of the writer, which again I presume to be, and I think I'm happy to hear your thoughts on this too, Mike. I tend to believe that Moses was the author of the Pentateuch, but it was heavily edited over time. And I'll leave it at that. That the reason we can say that is because we have in Genesis, is it 32, where the being touches Jacob's thigh, and then it says, this is why we don't eat the sinew or something like that. And then you have these phrases like, until this day, which is just throwing off to the reader the sense, oh, okay, so the guy writing this is writing it well after the fact, or redacting the text well after the fact. And he's telling us why something reads the way it does. So I'm happy to think that Moses wrote the Torah, but I'm also very content with the idea that that his work was heavily edited, right? So you can get in all sorts of theories on that, and that's where seminary spends its time, right, Mike? But for the reader of the text, I'm happy to say that God's story is being told by Moses, with editors helping him out over time. My point here with the word God is, though, that we have a very general term. It's the most general term, in fact, for a deity. So now let me show you also what you can do here when I have the word God here. If I ask my computer for every time, what you see on the left column now is God in red. What it's telling me, what I asked for, was give me every time the Hebrew word behind God shows up in this case, ESV. So I have a list now, Genesis 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, and this word God here is going to tie over to the word Elohim in each case. And as I stroll down through the text, of course, God is everywhere in Genesis 1. But the point is, as we move through it, there's going to be times when the word G-O-D with a capital G is not going to be the translation of Elohim. Are you following that? And in accordance, the way to check on that is to go to this word analysis and watch what they'll tell you. Very helpful. Here is the word Elohim. That's the key number, we call it. And then here's what it's telling me. In the ESV, Elohim, in the Hebrew Bible that let's be very careful here. In the Hebrew Bible that the ESV uses for its translation, Elohim occurs 2,597 times. Okay? Then, here's where it gets interesting. How is Elohim translated in the ESV? Okay, specifically in the ESV. Well, 2,316 times it's translated with a capital G-O-D. 207 times in the ESV, it will be found to be translated as G-O-D-S, small g. 48 times, in fact, it'll be translated small g-o-d. And it gets more specific, down the list. But my point is that, and here's where really a Bible study or a Bible program like Accordance or Logos is almost absolutely necessary for careful study, because within moments, at your fingertips, you can realize something like this. The word Elohim is a word that's generally 2316 out of 2597. It's going to be translated in the ESV as G-O-D, capital G. But I've always got to have in the back of my mind, it could be translated gods. It's the same exact word. There's no difference in the text. And so that's an example of the kind of care we have to take with the word Elohim. And let's pause. And again, Mike, throw your 2 cents in as you'd like to here. But it reminds us, and this is, by the way, where this Lost World of Genesis 1 book is so helpful. His argument is that Genesis, or Genesis 1 in this case, in this book, is never trying to step away from the cosmology of the average Israelite of that time period, which also was the cosmology of the average Egyptian, Mesopotamian, Babylonian, in other words. Is Genesis 1, well, there's 2 ways to say this. Genesis 1 is trying to, through Moses' thoughts, clarify which God created the earth, heavens and the earth. In doing so, he's using the cosmology, the words, the word pictures, the concepts of his worldview. He's not trying to create a separate cosmology at this point. In fact, it's always thrown us off because you get down to, let's just jump back to the regular text here. When you get down to where does he, let there be, look at verse 6, Genesis 1:6. And God said, let there be an expanse. And you've heard of it, see, in the New King James, it's firmament. The picture of the ancient world was, yes, I mean, if water is coming down during rain, that means water must be up. Think through their logic. And if it's up there, there must be something holding it up there. Then they thought that to be some kind of a firmament or some kind of an actual, covering over the earth that allowed water at various times to come down. Because water comes up sometimes through a spring, that means in my mind, I've got to have a pile of water below the earth. So adding to your cosmology, this idea, we got water up there, we've got something keeping the water from coming down. Then we have water below, but something, and every now and then it comes up. We have, well, what holds up that thing that holds up the water? We think in terms of poles or a rope or mountains. And that's their cosmology, again, of this firmament. If you've ever seen pictures of what the ancient world believed or the ancient mind believed the world to be like, you'd have this water above, cosmic waters, and then you have the water, then you have land, then you have something holding the waters back, then you've got pillars holding up that dome, and we don't know what they are, but they must be there, right? They have to be there. That's all they're thinking. So we've progressed in our science, and the Bible, again, allows this. But the point is, if we're going to do what the Divine Council Worldview number 1 requests, we've got to think like the original reader to make sense of this text. And so I don't mind saying in 1:6, God said, let there be this dome above the earth to keep the water out. Okay? And then we realize over time, as science moves forward, there's not a dome. But to their thinking, that's how they had to understand it. So, Mike, any thoughts there or anything you want to add? I'm wandering along, so if you want to jump in, you're welcome to.
I mean, I think you're bringing up good points in that. Like, so I remember, Dr. Heiser, he would have talked about this before, and the way that he described, I think his view about the inspiration and the writership of Genesis is similar to yours, Ron, where I think he used the term supplementarian.
Okay. Sounds like
idea,
accommodation or something like that.
It was this idea that he described. It used to be more common, but then the different, like the critical scholarship started coming up with their own terms. But the idea being that he held to this idea that it was a core of writing that was attributed to Moses. But to your point, he also acknowledged there were obvious points where there is an editor. There's another hand that's also in there that is adding and sort of bringing the text in some sense up to date for whoever the readership of that time was. And so there are a little bit of that. And I think his view of inspiration was that it wasn't just attributed to one person per book, but that it was a whole team overall that was working towards what we have as a final product. And so, he held that idea that inspiration wasn't just to one person, it was the whole entire process, and it wasn't just to one particular small amount of time, but that it was a long amount of time that eventually led to what we finally have. And so, I personally also don't think there's anything wrong in thinking that Moses had a hand in the written text and that he was using, in many ways, the knowledge that he had gained, if it really was that he was raised in an Egyptian home of all
Right.
things, even the Pharaoh's home. He would have been exposed to not just only the mythology and the religion of the Egyptians, but really to all of the different religions that the Egyptians had sway over, like the Hittites,
Right.
the Canaanites. They were all, in some sense, like sub-vassals of the Egyptian empire. And so there would have been this great vast amount of knowledge that Moses himself would have been exposed to and probably had played around with in using their language.
It makes you wonder if Moses wrote Genesis 1 to get back at his middle school Egyptian teacher who taught him that the gods, and by the way, this is very common in the ancient world, that the cosmic structures like the firmament and the rain itself and snow and all these things are equated with the gods to some degree, and that the origins of the gods then were connected to the origins of the cosmos, and that this is very common in the Mesopotamian literature, that creation itself is an aftermath of a battle between the gods for control over the cosmos. So if that's all going on in the mind of the average reader outside of Israel at this time, I can see where Moses would be writing this as a way to say, no, Genesis, or this book I'm writing, it depicts one God's creation of the physical cosmos, unlike the competing stories of Egypt and Babylon and so forth. I don't think, now, and I'm throwing out an idea here that is not consistent within the Divine Council Worldview proponents like you and I. Did Moses know the name of Yahweh at this point? He's writing after the story of Exodus 6, right? Exodus 6 will give us the story in which Moses, as an 80-year-old, will learn the name of of his deity. That's YHWH, pronounced Yahweh or Jehovah. So he could have put Jehovah in here, but he chose not to. And this is above my pay grade, but to know why Moses at what point would say, I'm going to use the word Yahweh, and other times he will say Elohim. Again, so much we could do there, but my basic position on it is Elohim is a title for any divine being. It's going to be used of any divine being in the Old Testament. And then theos in the New Testament, the Greek equivalent, will again be used of any divine being, including Satan. So the word Elohim doesn't mean God, it means divine being of some kind. What did Mike call it? A placeholder, or it describes where the being is coming from. That is in the heavens.
It's described like a location, a place of residence where
a place of residence. So, and then at other times, and we're not going to see it until chapter 2, we're going to have the name Yahweh actually in the text. So my point is that the reader will, by this point in reading the text, will have lived in a day when he would have known the name of Israel's deity, that being Yahweh. But there will be times like we saw in Genesis 1:1 where we're going to get just the word Elohim. By the way, I would say this as a means of introduction to biblical study in general. Don't ever equate Elohim and Yahweh as the same thing. So, because again, we see a capital G right here. That means in our head we say, well, that's Yahweh. And I understand that. But be ready for the word. In fact, this is in, let me show you one text that just throws us
Ron, before you do that, I think one good thing to kind of maybe mention is, so like, for example, right, the translation of Genesis 1:1 says God, and we can make the argument of whether that should be a capital G or small g,
right?
But what is not questionable, which I know some people, and this is where the whole entire kind of that adage of knowing just enough to become dangerous, can kick into place, where there are folks who would say, oh, that probably should be translated, in the beginning, the gods or gods created the heavens and the earth. But they ignore the fact that the verb for in Hebrew created is in singular. For the grammar to agree, it dictates that the word Elohim has to be translated, at least for it to make sense grammatically,
This would be one clear example of that. Yeah. So notice, you can hover over the word created and notice what you get at the bottom of the screen in a word processor like this, or a Bible software program like this. Bara, very bottom of the screen. Verb, cal, perfect, third masculine, singular, to create. So a singular being is doing the work of creating. That'd be the easy way to know that created must, as a verb, is connected to the noun Elohim here. So there's one God who is doing this word here, because that's just all caught up in the verb. Word Elohim, by the way, can be understood as plural, and there's no mystery to that. It's not like a divine thing where you've got Trinity kind of packed into this word Elohim. The point is, and we do this in English, fish, deer, Pokemon, you can use the word in singular or plural, sheep, and it doesn't denote anything beyond just that's the range of the word, so it's going to be common. I was going to show you, and thank you for that, I was going to show how early on in Genesis you have to make a decision how to translate Elohim. It's not, in other words, straightforward. 3:5 in ESV, for God knows, notice the bottom of the page there, singular absolute, to know. Okay, so there's the verb knows. This is Satan talking, or the serpent, talking to Eve. For Elohim knows, but I can tell by looking, holding it over the word knows there, that I've got a singular verb. That means that must be a singular noun. Mm-hmm. So we can translate this as, for he, the one God, knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened and you will be like Elohim. Okay. Now, again, almost every version goes like the ESV with capital G. You have to go back, and while you were talking, Mike, I switched out the New King James for the King James. Here's the old King James that matches up with the authorized version of 1901 and such. But notice how it translates the same verse. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes will be open, you shall be as gods. It actually goes ahead and puts the plural there. Notice again, as you see all three columns, one has capital G-O-D, one has small G-O-D-S, and the third has Elohim. The third column on the right doesn't help you. You have to make a decision. This is a theological decision. Is the serpent tempting Eve to be like Yahweh, or tempting her to be like himself? That's how I see this difference of opinion. So that's a good example of how difficult that can be. And I can't wait to, get into Genesis. We're going to have stories of a small G-O-D getting a capital G-O-D because just of nervousness by the translator. We just don't want to have small G-O-Ds everywhere. I've noticed in the modern Christian world, the Western Christian society that we all grew up in, we're just uncomfortable with small G-O-D-S's. And so we get rid of them out of the text, I'm noticing, often when we really shouldn't, or that we should allow the text to at least, think through the possibility. This is a small G-O-D here we're dealing with, not a capital G-O-D. So all that background, and I don't think it was wasted time. I hope it wasn't. To say that when we get into a Divine Council Worldview, the opening 3 or 4 words of the text allow us to, or really force our hand in deciding how many gods are there. Is there only one? Who gets the capital G? Why do we capitalize it? Those kind of questions are all bound within that last, 15, 20 minutes of talking. So the story of Genesis 1:1 basically says, to me, one God is creating the physical cosmos. Other competing stories that the reader may have been aware of, Enuma Elish, those kind of things, they're not true based on this story. This story says only one God did it. So I'm ready to move on if you are, Mike. And basically, just I'm not working through all the 6 days of creation. Yeah. Genesis 1 has 6 days of creation. Day 1 is 3 through 5. Day 2, 6 to 8, so forth. They end the story like if we go to 1, is it 8? And the evening and the morning. Their day starts in the ancient world. I think it was Israel. Well, I know for Israel, but I wonder if other nations also did this, that their day started at sundown. So that's why you have the wording. So. But
I think, Ron, just as we close out the Genesis 1:1, I think one of the key things, and this helped me years ago, was to realize that like you said at the beginning of this podcast, right? We're looking at this from the standpoint of a story. And so I do think it's pretty ingenious. Moses or whoever ultimately helped craft how even that verse starts off, that it does start off a little mysteriously. Because if this is technically the beginning of a story, and if you are exposed to a world and a worldview where there is a spiritual realm, there's multiple gods, there's a whole pantheon, there's so many stories where you have a whole pantheon of gods who are all basically vying for creation. They're all making their own thing, and the stories are all telling you explicitly it's this God that does this and this God that does that. And yet here, very counterintuitively, the Hebrew version of creation starts off with a little bit of mystery. Yeah. It uses a word that you're very commonly used to, gods, but then now you're hearing a verb that comes after it that says it's singular. Yeah. So already it's going to start throwing you off if you were a listener from that kind of worldview and that culture. And
you would have been interested to hear how this is going to go. How are you going to have a world that's only run by one God? I remember there was a part of a video done by, it was a video of Joseph in his time in Egypt. I forget which company did it, but it was a great video in the sense that I used it in class a lot because it really followed through on the idea of what it would have been like for a Joseph who was a monotheist to live in Egypt under plural gods, right? And the first conversation he has with Potiphar's helper, who was figuring out who this Joseph guy was, when he found out he only worshipped one God, he had this fascinating conversation with him about, poor soul, you only worship one. Oh, and he was trying to help him. He was saying, it really helps if you have more than one. And as a monotheist today, we think, boy, that guy's missing out. But in his world, you missed out if you only had one, right? And so just well done by that video. Thank you, Mike. That's a good point. And I was going to say, and I just brought a pile here to show, this is commonly, I asked on like a Facebook group, the DCW Facebook group and such, what commentary should I buy that can give me a Divine Council Worldview? Or what book has been written? The point is, and here's where Mike again felt like he was running out of time. There is no book. There is no textbook on the Divine Council Worldview. There's books maybe have that in the title, but when it comes to how to study the Bible from a Divine Council Worldview, I'd recommend that you have, as you have time and money, you invest in separate books that deal with the subjects of it. So like things like this is this is the fastest growing part of my library and has been for a while. Books called like The Ancient Gods by E.O. James, Introduction to Ancient Mesopotamian Religion, Old Testament Cosmology and Divine Accommodation. John Hilber's a good friend of Mike and good book. I've not had, again, I wish I had time to just sit and read these things. An old book by who's it by? I can't even tell. The Gods of the Gentiles. Boy, that'd be fun to read. I just got this for Christmas. Gods, Goddesses, and the Women Who Serve Them by Susan Ackerman. Mark Smith, a very popular writer that I'd recommend anything he writes, grab a hold of. The Early History of God. Now, he's not an evangelical. And again, most of these books I would recommend, except for Hilber is. But a lot of these books that I'm holding up are not from evangelicals, but that's the point. You have to read non-evangelical stuff to get the discussion going about, even as we talked about here, the meaning of the word Elohim. The Hebrew God, a portrait of an ancient deity. Again, Mark Smith, The Origins of Biblical Monotheism. He's going to, again, take a view that Mike himself didn't take and I wouldn't take, but again, we need to read it. I just love this title. What is a God? Well, that made me grab it right off the shelf. I bought it at ETS in 2009 for $26. And guess what? I've not read it yet. I haven't had time. But can you think of a more fascinating title to a book? What is a God? So that's my point about reading is if you want to get into this stuff, and this is a good thing, it's a good problem to have, you just have to read everything. You just have to never say, oh, I can't read that. It's not written by an inerrantist or something like that, or it's not written by a Baptist. The best friends you have in this business of reading the Bible, to me, are non-evangelicals, because they aren't under a creedal or confessional prescription. In other words, their paycheck doesn't depend on them holding a certain line of thinking. Now, sometimes it might if they're at Yale or Harvard, and maybe they've got a chairman who would fire them if they sounded, too fundamental or something like that. But generally speaking, I trust people who don't have a creedal reason to say what they do. They just want to go after the text or the history of the text and those kind of things. That's my personal judgment. So, go ahead.
I would encourage, and at least from my own recent seminary experience, at least when you're at a seminary that is very purposely non-denominational or even interdenominational, then the variety of being open to actually more critical or liberal or however you want to term type of scholarship, it isn't something scary then for us.
Right.
Because we already have a very firm idea about what we hold on to, but at the same time, we want to glean as much good scholarship and data that there is, because we don't want to keep ourselves in essentially an echo chamber. Right. And I think that's one of the things I've been encouraged to see is that there are more and more professors at the school that I had gone to that they had heard of Mike's research and they had heard about all these other kind of researches as well. They may have their various opinions, but they're not surprised by it. And they have been willing to engage in it. I think one of the things I remember once telling Mike, for example, that one scholar, John Goldingay, in his Genesis commentary, he actually talked about the Divine Council, and he talked about other things that some evangelicals would have been a little bit more uncomfortable with. And it was a surprise. I actually didn't know too much about Goldingay. I just stumbled upon his commentary because of another scholar friend. And I was so happy to see that he actually was acknowledging the language has some of the stuff that's going on. And here are some of the stories that happened in the ancient Near East. And so I think slowly we as evangelicals, at least in the confessional scholarship side, are starting to move towards being willing to look at the data more and more and not being afraid of it. And I think it's just needing to have those trusted voices and folks who actually can help guide through and how do you discern the material?
Yeah. Now, it's fair to say as an 18-year-old heading off to college, I know I wasn't taught this way. I mean, if I had been handed as an 18-year-old at a Bible college, I went to Bible college with Mike, and we were never handed this kind of material. We were given, texts that the teacher agreed with almost 100%. But that's why the Divine Council concept never came up, because think through again why we're here talking like this in the heritage of a Mike Heiser. We didn't talk about it because evangelicalism has not read liberal work. That's just not their role. And so most seminary classes for evangelical pastors, at least in the history of it, and I'm glad to hear that things are a little different at Gordon where you were, but most wouldn't even go down a path of talking about something that they didn't want their students to believe, right? So like that echo chamber idea, that was college for me, and even some of seminary. It took after seminary, reading these kind of books where I realized these people aren't enemies of the Bible. They have a different view, clearly, but they're not enemies. They're not going at it with a hand or a fist raised to God saying, I'm going to try to teach people how not to believe or respect the Bible. Mm-hmm. They're saying, this is the book that I understand to be telling this story, and many of them are firm believers, by the way. And I won't even give names here, but I remember one guy that I always, you read his book and you think, there's no way he's just so different in his biblical interpretations than I am. And I was at a conference once, and he was up there talking about something, and he gave this story and he pulled out a piece of pottery that he had gotten when he was in Israel once as a young student, and he just told the story of he's had this pottery in his hand or in his office ever since that time, or in his pocket or in his office. And he says, whenever I look at this piece of pottery, I remind myself of giving my life, even as a young boy, to Jesus Christ, and that I will do anything to serve you. And it was just this moment of what? I didn't expect to come, that to come out of the mouth of a flaming liberal is who he is. I mean, if you want to know, but he's a liberal who is as committed to his Christian faith as I've ever heard. And as I've read him since, I see that echo, that shadow of Christian, well, this beautiful loyalty coming through his writings on every turn. But he wouldn't say the Bible's inspired. That's one of his, views that tend to make evangelicals not read him. So we're getting off the topic a little bit, but I think we're able to bring the plane back onto the landing runway here, or the approach. I think okay. Let's in fact, let me just say this as we get to through 1 and close out chapter 1. We don't have to go through the actual days of creation, right? Is that fair that you as the listener can read good commentaries? Here's one again. Bible background commentaries are the best. Those who try to understand the actual culture of the time period. So in fact, this is John Walton and Victor Matthews. It's getting old now. So the Bible background commentary. Do your reading there on those days. Walton's view, by the way, is that the first 3 days established functions, and the second 3 days, so days 4, 5, and 6, established or installed the functionaries. So like the function of day 1 was to begin the concept of time, the rotation of morning and evening. The concept of day 2 was to establish weather patterns, rain, and so forth. And then day 3, I forget the third, how he puts it, but he's trying to see these days not in just the physical, this is made and this is made, but the idea that this is the function of how our world works, and it was put into play over these 6 days. Again, do we want these to be 24-hour days or day age or whatever? I don't spend any mental concern on that myself. I mean, whatever's true is true, and I can't wait to find out someday. But right now in my own study, I listen to those conversations, but I don't put a lot of mental energy or angst into them. What I would like to do, if you're okay with this, Mike, as we close up, is get to day 6, because that's really where things, of course, make headway when it comes to what happens to what God creates. That's you and I. So let's get there. But notice how we're coming through, and we could have done this if you're looking at the text here in front of me. You're going through Genesis 1:11 and hearing this idea of according to its kind. 1:12 said twice, according to its kind. When God's creating plants, animals, and such, he does them in such a way, and he says this twice in verse 12, twice in verse 21, twice in verse 24, and now it's on the screen twice, actually 3 times in verse 25. God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, livestock according to their kinds. A very common word, or at least it's not a theological word. And everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. So 3 times in 25. That's a total of 10 times we have this according to its kind concept. The very next verse, and I think, again, here's where I'm certainly open to translations and understandings. Mike and I, talked about this, and anybody who talks about divine counsel is going to get into this concept. So to me, it's not you have to take one view or the other. Let me give you my opinion and bounce it off yours, Mike, and we can close with that, okay, as we close out chapter 1. Then God said, the same being, singular, that word Amar probably said there, Amar is singular, yep. So God, the singular God said, let us make Aman. Now, by the way, what's nice about this program, like if I put the cursor right over that, there are 4 texts in the Old Testament where God, in speaking, uses a plural pronoun. Let us, in this case. The problem, if we say that's Trinity, is, well, why only 4, right? Why would God, in 4 specific, notice the bottom of the page, Genesis 3:22, Genesis 11:7, and Isaiah 6:8. We have God saying, let us. There are 4 times he specifically uses that plural pronoun. Mm-hmm. We don't know why those 4 and those 4 only, but to me, I'm just saying that if we were to say, well, that's the Trinity, the first problem I would have with it is, well, why only these 4 then? Why wouldn't he always be talking in plural terms? But my guess is this, and this is part of the Divine Council Worldview in general, that when God breaks into this pronoun of plurality idea, he's talking to someone who's already there with him. In the ancient world, a king's greatness was often presumed by the size of his court. The larger the court of other dignitaries, the greater the king, right? So the idea, I think this would have been, again, to the average reader of this time period of Moses, he would not have thought Trinitarian thoughts at all. He would have thought, oh, this God is a great God because he has others with him. That's all he would have said in response to this "let us" moment. Okay? Any thoughts there, Mike?
I actually agree with that. I do. It's kind of funny. The story that instantly comes to my mind is it was actually my first year in seminary, and I'm doing Intro to OT. First class is in Genesis, and my professor asks us the question, "Who's the us?"
Yeah,
and essentially she provided two options: who says it's the Trinity, and then who says it's God and the angels. And so she had raise your hand, and so pretty much everyone raised their hand for the Trinity. And then I was the only one to actually raise my hand for God and his angels. And when I did that, I remember hearing someone in the back of the class like chuckle or snicker because they thought I was ridiculous. And then my professor looked at me, smiled, and said, "You know what? A lot of Jewish commenters and a lot of the ancient Jewish literature, that was their assumption." And so she took a middling position. That is the Trinity there? Yes, now that we know what God is like. Well, but at the same time, from the audience perspective that Moses was writing to, because she also took the view that Genesis was written by Moses, that, well, would he have been thinking about Trinity? No.
Right.
He probably was thinking about all of the angels, all the spiritual beings that God had created. And so I just remember looking later, and so the classmates in my class, they just looked at me with I guess the way that Mike would have said it, like a second head growing out of my neck.
Right. And that's a good example of well-meaning, your students are well-meaning, your fellow students. And it's not that they heard this view and rejected it. They probably had never heard of this idea that the greater the king in this world, the greater his court. They wouldn't have thought that way. So to enter this world of Genesis and of Moses, to me, it makes the best sense that, again, Trinitarianism can stand later, but let's let the text speak for its own time, making sense to the original reader and writer. So then God said, "Let us," those beings that are surrounding me that I've already created. By the way, that would demand of the text that we have angels or gods, divine beings, already created by Genesis 1:25, right? And so, and now everyone agrees with that because you never have the creation of angels or gods anywhere in the story, unless it's 2:4. Is it? Well, 2:1. All the host of them. I'm close in the text here, so let me show it to you. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. Tsabaot in Hebrew for host can sometimes mean, notice at the bottom of the page there, army, war, service. So the army of God, the Tsabaot, Lord God of Tsabaot, Lord God of hosts. So 2:1 may be a way of saying all the gods were created. But anyway, back to 126. I'm giving you my opinion and then letting you run with it, Mike, see if you agree. So he's just said 10 times, I'm making this according to its kind, this according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. 25. Then 26. Let us make man. Hebrew word there is aman. Notice the bottom of the page. Aman, or Adam. Did I say aman? That's another word. Adam. Get that out of your head. Man here is Adam, and it means mankind. Okay, or it can mean mankind. So don't think name here. Think title. So let us make mankind. What's that little number 8 there? Oh, in fact, this is in the ESV study notes. The Hebrew word for man, Adam, is the generic term for mankind, becomes the proper name for Adam. So everything I just said, there it is in the text, in the footnote. But let us make Adam in our, so here's that us now turning into our, image after our likeness. Now, let me make 2 points that are often missed in this conversation. Number one, we're not made in the image of Elohim, God, capital G. Notice we're made in the image of a plural being, a plurality of beings. Let us make man in our, purposely plural there, Image. So whatever it means to me, I'm giving you my opinion. I know that image that I have is the image not of Yahweh. It would be the image of divine beings in general. Okay. Number two, he also says, and this only happens in one other verse, it's in 5:3, I think it is, where Seth is born to Adam, and he was after his image, after his likeness. The word image, tselem, and likeness,
singular,
demut. Singular construct. After our, this is singular here. I wonder if that is required by the
noun.
This is singular construct as well. But is the, in other words, the let us make man in our image, he doesn't say my, and I'm wondering if the point being, and after our likeness, and I was going to say my second point being that image and likeness are one other time equated as synonyms, that we're not trying to get specific, we're trying to talk, this looks like this. And here's my point, that in my opinion, and Mike heard my view on this and thought I was nuts, but let it be what it be, that after 10 times saying, I'm going to make things according to their kind, dogs will look like dogs, cats like cats, and they don't interbreed, right? Everything's according to its kind. Then God said, well, let's make man and he had a kind of a wistful thought. Should we make them like themselves, or should we make them like, let's make them like us? In other words, we're going to make them more like gods than dogs, so that they'll have pets in their home, but they won't be able to talk. And I know you say you talk to your dog. No one talks to their dog. I talk to my dog, but my dog hears syllables, or he knows phrases, but I don't think he understands language, right? So my point is that I converse. When I go out for a walk with my dog, I'm talking to God and I'm walking my dog. And that relationship is something that is firmed up in a verse like this of Genesis 1 at the end of the story when he creates mankind, that he says that what's going to be different about this hairless biped that will be, and he knows how it's going to go, right? That we're going to be compared to apes, and some people are going to think we're like apes. God's going to say this, God says this, at a point in the story where you think you're like an animal, I want you to know, humans, you are not like an animal. You have a mind that thinks, reacts, feels, and even coordinates or communicates with the divine world. You may not even know it, but when you think thoughts, you're thinking divine thoughts, and the divine world is hearing you. And so that's what sets up in my mind Genesis 3, that this snake, serpent, obviously used by a divine being, can talk to Eve. It's because of 126. So that's my thought on the image of God. It's very rudimentary. It's very, bottom brick kind of thing. If people want to get into, is the image functional, subjective? What are the options? There's many. Is it a picture of a temple where we put the image in the, the Holy of Holies, and that the Garden of Eden's a temple and God puts his image in the garden? Yeah, that's a very common one nowadays. N.T. Wright's all over that. I think Mike likes that view as well. I know John Walton likes the view. And I'm okay with that. I'm just thinking that's kind of, okay, that's an interesting application or thought, but would the original reader, when he heard, let us make man in our image, after hearing 10 times, let's make dogs in dogs' images, wouldn't they have thought, wow, I'm going to be made, and I am, thus, mankind is made to look like an animal, but not to be like an animal. That's all I'm saying. So as we close up, what do you think?
I mean, I think that's an interesting kind of play on some, because I remember Mike had talked about that. Like his main push was against the idea that the image of God was like some sort of characteristic, because there's so many fallacies that can come up with that, because if you can find ways to essentially dehumanize other people by just simply saying, well, they don't have this characteristic. So thus, like a retarded, not made,
mentally retarded person, because they can't function mentally, they don't have the image or something like that. And Mike would say, no, you can't do that.
Exactly. Or, you get into other more disparaging kind of ideologies that find some other characteristic or trait that they would say, oh, this prioritizes it, and thus why you're human versus you're not human.
Yeah.
And then it can go down really bad pathways. And so I thought it was a very wise thing for him, where he acknowledged it's there, but he described it as it's like a coin with two sides. You don't have one that dominates the other.
Okay.
And I mean, I do lean now these days towards the idea of divine representation, that we are the image, the selim of God to our society, to the world, in that we represent him, and that there's that ambassadorship, that beauty of actually being representatives of God.
To me, that flows right out of what I was saying, in this sense that as I'm walking my dog and I'm talking to God and walking my dog, right? There's that difference. My neighbor walks by me. I represent Yahweh to him, not my dog, right? And so that's all bound up in that idea to me. I mean, that's what the text wants eventually to get to. Yeah. So 127, so God created, there's the singular. Who created man? Well, obviously, again, 127, it's a singular Elohim. He created Adam in his own. So there we have I'm in the image of Yahweh idea. There's a more specific one. But then he repeats it, I think, in the sense of trying to remind us it's in the image of Elohim, plural. So I take this in the image of God, he created him, is not restating the first sentence. It's saying he created you in the image of a divine being that, that we're around him, so that we have, and see, to me, this sets up, like you said, 1-1 kind of sets up this moment of mystery. Like, what in the world? We got a singular deity creating everything. Imagine, as to me this story goes, what it's, and let's literally land the plane now and close up shop. On this episode, the world's view at this time was that humans were used by the gods, that the jobs that the gods didn't want to do, they gave to humans, and that we are this kind of offspring of, or that we're the result of the battle of the gods above us, and we are just these things to be used by the divine world. Very common view of the ancients. At the other end of the pole, the other end of the spectrum, comes Genesis 1, where it says, one God creates everything. And oh, by the way, at the end of the story here, he creates a group of hairless bipeds that could be mistaken for animals, and they absolutely are not. They are in the image and likeness of divine beings, and they thus will have a story to tell on their own and also in relationship to these divine beings. So to me, it sets up this, beyond 1-1, as you said, it also sets up this mystery story to be told of, or suspenseful story of, I wonder what's going to happen to these beings that could be mistaken for animals but are not, and what's God going to do with them. So that's enough for me for chapter 1.
Can I just simply say that verse 27 is fascinating?
Yeah.
Because of just that, it starts off, God created humanity in his singular image, but in the image of gods. Yeah. He created them.
And then he adds male and female. Oh, by the way, both of them have that.
It's just that verse is just so packed, but there's just something very beautiful about it. It's like there's ownership, but then there's also community. Mm-hmm. And then again, there's community. And then there's also ownership.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I don't know. That verse itself is just so impactful and also just so beautiful and complex.
Yeah. And God bless them. So yeah. And again, now we have to do chapter 2 next time, and I'm going to give you my view on 2, and Mike thought I was nuts on that one too. So I'm looking forward to giving you my opinion. But when I say nuts, what Mike would do, I just, again, love this memory of him, is we'd talk and he'd smile and he'd look at me with that disdaining look, like, oh, brother. And then he would kind of, but I knew I was onto something when he gave me that look, because it wasn't one of, you're wrong. It was, oh, come on. And then but he stayed my friend and he kept listening. And it's like that story we told last time of two people walking through a woods, and you see the trees between you, and you're wondering if you're on the same path or not eventually. And Mike and I always were. Our path often would, there you are again. And then we'd head off in another direction, come back again. But that's what I want this podcast to be, is if a person is interested in the Divine Council Worldview, here are some things to think about. Here's where the text deals with it, right? And so in Genesis 1, we've already hit on 2, 1:1, 1:26. You have to kind of choose your path and go forward, knowing that there's other meeting places ahead. But here are certain decision points we have to make along the way. So, well, thank you, Mike. Let's call it a day. Male and female, he created them. That reminds me, I'm taking my wife to her pedicure momentarily. So she asked me this morning if I wanted a pedicure, and I said, I can't think of something I want less in my life than someone to take off my socks. So I said, my socks are staying on.
Well, it's a loving thing that you would take her at least.
Well, I go to a coffee shop and take along my Lost World of Genesis 1 and get a shake. So I have nefarious reasons on the backside of that, but no, we always do those things together, and we'll go shopping. And we're going to a Michael Card concert tonight. He's finishing up his career of concert giving, and one of his last concerts is going to be up here in the little town of Anoka, Minnesota, in a venue that holds no more than 100 people. So
no kidding.
Me and some friends, 21 of us, got tickets and going to see him tonight. So
my sister Ruth, even before I became a Christian, I just remember she loved Michael Card. And so she probably would have been a little jealous right now to hear that you're actually getting to hear him.
We had him in our church when I was pastoring. He came and did a weekend conference. Just delightful. And wow. Just to get to know him, over coffee and stuff was probably the highlight for me. But we'll end it here. Thank you again, Mike, and thanks everyone for listening. And we'll talk to you next time.